Thank you to everyone attending today. My name is Kathy Dugan, and I'm the director of the Cleveland Law Library. And I'm going to be moderating this discussion today with my colleague. And would you like to introduce yourself, Helena?
Hi, I'm Helena Trafka from the Cleveland Public Library Social Sciences Department. I'm going to have my mask on today because I may need to be called away and everything. So just for our safety and everything, I have to keep it on. But welcome everybody.
And I just wanted to let everyone know we are recording this program today. So we'd appreciate it if you would mute yourself when you're not speaking. And turning your camera on is totally optional for all attendees, except of course our speaker. Today we are very happy to welcome local author David Lynch, and he's going to discuss his debut novel, an autobiography entitled Snowball's Chance. Here's a spoiler alert. Dave's book chronicles the struggles he endured and the triumph he achieved in overcoming the local political machine to become the mayor of Euclid, Ohio. Dave is a retired lawyer who practiced law in Cleveland for 37 years, and he graciously served on the Cleveland Law Library Association's board for several years. I'm pleased to have Dave here today, and I would like to get this book discussion started by asking him to give us a little bit about his background.
Sure. Thanks, Kathy, and thanks everybody for attending. Snowball's Chance, Kathy sort of used the word autobiography. It's probably closer to a memoir, and all I mean by that is it's not my whole life. In fact, it's only a snapshot of my life. It's basically the year 1987, essentially, and what I went through in that year, and that's when I ran for mayor of the city of Euclid. So I am a Cleveland, Ohio area resident from the very beginning of my life, and attended a local high school in Cleveland Heights, went to John Carroll University, went to law school at Georgetown University, practiced law for a very extensive period of time before I retired. But during that period of time, really prior to my law practice, I was shocked and surprised and delighted to be elected mayor of Euclid, which at that time was a city of about 70,000 people. Euclid today is probably closer to about 54,000 people, but certainly not a small city. And at that time, it had a budget probably in the vicinity of $200 million, a council of 9 people, and was a full-time mayor's job as what they call a strong mayor. That is, where the mayor actually has management authority. In some communities, the mayor doesn't have management authority, and management is turned over to someone called a city manager. And so when I finished being mayor, I ended up practicing law and then got back, retired from law practice, and became a city manager, bringing a lot of my experience to bear, where I was city manager for the village of Newton Falls for about 3 years. And last August, I turned my attentions to really laying the foundation for the release of this book. And when I talk about it in these terms, politics can be very dry, government can be very dry. This book is really, it's a drama about somebody trying to do something that's almost impossible against very difficult and terrifying odds, then being able to overcome it. And so I call it sort of a David versus Goliath story. And to me, that's what makes the book interesting and I think, and I hope, fun to read. Everybody likes to figure out how did somebody, a story about somebody who conquers Mount Everest, or a story about somebody, who is born barely able to walk, and before you know it, they're a quarterback in the Super Bowl. These overcoming significant hurdles. And I also hope that in the end, it's sort of a source of inspiration. So people can realize that in real life, amazing things do happen.
So tell us a little bit about the process of writing it and getting it published and editing it, all of the above.
Yeah, getting any book off the ground is tough for a few reasons. This book, probably the writing of it probably started 6 or 7 years ago. Although I had always said to myself, it's such an unbelievable story that I've got to put pen to paper. And, almost everybody has some kind of event in their life which is worthy of putting onto paper, letting other people hear about it. But very few people actually get around to writing it out. And so it began probably about 7 years ago. And the form it's in now was essentially done maybe about 4.5 years ago. Finding a publisher is very tough because you have to find an agent to represent you with that publisher, unless you can break through and find a publisher. And I happened to run into a fellow who lives in Mentor, who had his own small publishing house called Faulkner Publishing. And on a whim, I asked if he'd take a look at the book. And he called me back and said, I want to be the publisher, and he is. And so the publisher is Faulkner Press. And Peter Faulkner, who runs Faulkner Press, actually has some experience in publishing. He was with Simon and Schuster, although he wasn't in the nonfiction or biography or memoir section. He was mostly doing textbooks for Simon and Schuster, which is probably one of the largest publishers in the world. But he learned the publishing business as well. And so I was delighted to have a real publisher to help me move this thing forward. And this book was ready to come out at the beginning of 2020. And then COVID hits, and every bookstore chain in America said, we're not doing book signings. We refuse to do that. As a matter of fact, Barnes & Noble still has a prohibition against book signings. So the commercial outlets became very limited, and the opportunity to promote the book, which is really meaning going out into the public and doing book signings, was very, very limited. And so, no pun intended, we shelved the release of the book until this time. And, God willing, the creek don't rise, the COVID restrictions will continue to fall away, and we'll be able to promote this book in a more significant and meaningful way. But this was a book that was ready to go a couple of years ago. As a matter of fact, the hardback edition says copyright 2020, and the book is available on Kindle books right now. The hardback will be released by Amazon in a couple of weeks. So that we are in the midst of what is referred to in the business as a soft launch, which means you're not really in a mass promotional sort of opportunity or format right now, but it just got made live by Kindle yesterday. These book discussions are a nice way to begin to engender interest.
And is this the very first one, Dave?
Yes, this is the very first one, and hopefully the first of many.
Good,
By the
good.
way, on Kindle, the book is only $6.99 on Kindle, so it's a very, very inexpensive opportunity, and that's not unusual for Kindle. Kindle, obviously, you're not holding something that uses a lot of paper and gasoline for trucks and so forth. So Kindle books are usually very much less expensive.
So tell us the plot of the story, because people haven't had the chance to read it.
Yeah, right. Well, it's a true story. In 1987, I was a councilman in this community, having served only one term as a councilman. And I detected that the government in charge at that time, who was headed up by a mayor who went by the nickname of Fat Tony, their name, not mine. Fat Tony and his group were running the community. And as I became more understanding of what was going on in the city, I got the sense that the city was mired in some real corruption. And in addition to that, a terrible racist approach. The group that was in charge of the city, they weren't Democrats or Republicans. They had formed their own party for the city of Euclid called the Coalition Party. And they ran things with an iron fist. And one of their selling points to the public, now remember this was 1987, and this is terrible what they did, but they essentially, Euclid was mostly a white community by demographic, and they essentially said, keep electing us and we'll make sure that Euclid remains a white community. And so the police sort of became an arm of the coalition by rousting out people of color. And the judge, certainly, they had their own municipal court judge, and he certainly made a point of lowering the boom on minorities. And so Euclid became sort of an illegal ground for, or dangerous ground for minorities to go into. At the same token, when this was going on in the east side, there was a suburb on the west side, which was sort of doing the same thing. The west side suburb was called Parma, Ohio. And federal authorities actually intervened in Parma because of some of the things they were doing, like they were doing in Euclid. And in 1987, I ran for mayor. And in 1987 in Parma, a guy by the name of Mike Reese was also youthful. That is, I was around 29 when I ran for mayor. Mike Reese was about the same age. And he ran on a similar platform of cleaning up the corruption and getting rid of the racism. He shocked the world by getting elected mayor in Parma in the same election where I got elected mayor in Euclid. And Dave Jones of the News Herald, which is the predominant newspaper in the Lake County, Eastern Cuyahoga County area, described my election as, now these are his words, not mine, the biggest political upset in the history of Cuyahoga County. Well, that's saying something, but it was a really big deal and a shocker. And that's why the book itself is so exciting, because this unbelievable thing, this snowball's chance in hell of somebody defeating this powerful group. And by the way, Mayor Junta's coalition won the mayor's race first in 1937 and never lost a single race until 1987 when this drama unfolded.
Wow. Now, this suggests that there would have been some undercurrent of intimidation maybe against your campaign. Did you experiencing anything like that?
Oh yeah, that's on a constant basis. You know, after it was all over, Nancy and I have to have admitted to ourselves, but Nancy, my wife, who was sort of my main support and right-hand person for keeping me on an even keel, realized that if we had known after it was all over with what was going to be thrown at us, we probably would have not made the decision to run. So it took a certain degree of naivete to jump into this. Fat Tony and his group were tied into some fellows in Youngstown, Ohio, who had financially supported them. And, you know, unfortunately, Youngstown, Ohio, that's a euphemism for mafia involvement. And I go into some detail about how the mafia was involved in supporting Fat Tony and how fearful we were about what was going to happen. In fact, there's even an incident described where the mafia bombed someone's house in Euclid, blew up their whole house in Euclid, because this guy wasn't towing the line in terms of the mafia's requirements for some of the things that he had been up to. And I even have pictures of the police report and the bombed out house in the book. So the fear and intimidation at its very harshest and most terrifying level was real. And then of course, there was the undercurrent, the whispering campaign that if you vote for David Lynch, you're going to destroy the moral integrity of the community because minorities will be allowed in the community. And it's actually kind of laughable when you look at it now, because what was David Lynch going to do other than make sure that laws were followed? Federal laws prohibited housing discrimination, but housing discrimination was all over Euclid and supported by the administration. And yeah, it was a very scary, uncertain time in my life, and of course in the life of for my wife Nancy too.
Now, did you buy or have a bodyguard or any type of security to get you through
No,
it?
I was on my own. So from a physical standpoint, I was on my own. But Nancy was of great encouragement to me. And she also had pretty good savvy about the community. She was originally from Euclid. I was not. But I also had another sort of right-hand person to guide me through, and that was Joe Farrell. And Joe Farrell was at that time a councilman at large. After I was elected, he became the president of the city council. And he was very experienced in Euclid politics, had run for mayor twice and lost. And the only reason he didn't run in the election, which I did, was that he thought it was a difficult, terrifying, intimidating experience, and he did not want to go through that again. So I had some people that I could put my trust in, and some shoulders that I could lean on for moral support, and that's really what I needed more than anything else. There was this fear, Kathy, but even the coalition did not think I had any chance. So, in fact, Joe Farrell used to say, they said, look, Dave, if they thought you had a real chance, they'd have done something to you. They'd have hurt you. They'd have killed you. They'd have done something like that. But don't worry about it, because not only do they not think you have a chance, I don't think you have a chance. No one's worried about you. This is not going to happen. So just do the best you can, and no one's going to do anything physically to you. And of course, even afterwards, I learned more about the mafia connections, and again realized that it was a pretty almost in a way foolhardy thing to do, but nonetheless, it ended up having very positive consequences.
Is that the reason why you waited, so long to write the book until, everything's settled and,
Yeah, I think that's true to some extent. Unfortunately, with a book like this, where it's not fiction, so you're naming names. And most of the people that I identified as being pretty sinister are either dead or so up in age that it probably doesn't matter anymore. Mayor Junta died shortly after my reelection to a second term. And a lot of these characters, though, remember, I was a young man of about 29 or 30, and these were gentlemen who were in their mid to upper 50s to 60s. So that means the ones that are still alive right now are in their mid to upper 80s, maybe even to 90s. So it became safe again. Well, and by the way, that doesn't mean no one's going to sue me. Somebody, one of this publisher said to me, I said, well, what if somebody sues me because they don't know what they like? He says, that's good. A lawsuit will stir up a lot of good public attention to your book, and you'll sell more books. So
isn't the truth a defense too?
Yes, that's right. Especially because these people are all public figures, and as you know, under the defamation laws in Ohio, at least, public figures have a very high level of proof they need to obtain in order to have somebody liable. Once you're a public figure, essentially you're fair game for almost anything, including lies. But of course, I live this, so this is all the real cold hard truth.
And are you proud of what you did in Euclid while you were mayor and how it's changed over time?
Yeah. I was mayor for 8 years, and by the way, that's 2 terms. And I had pledged I would only serve for 2 terms. One of the things about the coalition was they held on the mayor's office from 1937 until 1987 when I came along. And the idea that once elected, you own that piece of government territory, I think is inconsistent with what the founding fathers looked at elected office as. All our founding fathers had jobs, George Washington was a surveyor, and Ben Franklin was a publisher, and Thomas Jefferson was an architect and a farmer. The theory that government is a lifelong assignment is really inconsistent with the founding fathers. So I had taken a 2-term pledge, and it was a great 8 years. I was selected by the United States Junior Chamber of Commerce as the best young mayor in the United States of America, and that was kind of a highlight, so to speak. I also hired the first Black police officer in the city's history, and we helped Euclid, take a walk into the modern age of diversity and fairness when it comes to racial composition.
That's a hard act to follow, don't you think?
Yeah, it is. It is. Well, that's why, some people have said, well, do another book about what happened after the election, because this book basically ends after the election. But I do enjoy writing, so we'll see what happens. I think I'd be interested in getting into the area of fiction just because I love to write. I did spend some time after I was mayor, and for about 2.5 years, I wrote columns for the News Herald newspaper, as a matter of fact, and that column was called the Lynch Pen, and people can find that by going to the News Herald website and can see all those columns. So I was essentially writing long before this book was put to paper. And in addition to that, I spent almost all my time as mayor, and during the time recently as city manager in Newton Falls, writing my own speeches and my own materials for anything. So unfortunately, a lot of people in public life, especially that are in public life on a full-time basis, rely on speechwriters. And by the way, there's nothing wrong with that at all. But I wasn't elected at some federal level, so I had the time and the inclination to do my own writing, and I think that helped hone my skills in terms of not just the column, but eventually Snowball's Chance.
And I've done other things in your life too. What else have you done that would be interesting for our attendees today?
Well, the music's always been a big part of my life. So I was the choir director over at our church over in Euclid, and matter of fact, I'm with the choir right now over in Huntsburg, just east of Chardon. I've written quite a bit of music as relates to religious songs and some secular tunes as well. And just recently, I auditioned to be in the chorus for Phantom of the Opera on Broadway. And that's rather shocking, but I haven't heard back from them yet, by the way. So who knows? But my point is that I've always kept my hand in music, and find myself at the piano composing or doing whatever, probably 4 or 5 times a week. So
Any foray into TV?
Oh, well, thank you. I did. It's funny how you skip over chapters of your life. Yeah, I spent about 2 years as the host of Live with David Lynch, which was on the WB network. And it ran for about 2 years in about 13 cities across the United States. And I have all those. Essentially, it was like Dave Lynch version of the Johnny Carson show. We had a band and so forth, and it was great fun. So I just like to keep my creative juices flowing. And one of the joys of this post-city managership in Newton Falls for me has been the chance to really spend some time honing some of these musical things. I talked about this thing with the Phantom of the Opera. So, I'm 64 years old. So now how much longer can I create and be highly productive in the creative area? So I'm thinking I got maybe about 20 years left, and I want to make the very best of them. So you didn't mention that you come from a legal family. Yeah, that's right. My dad grew up during the Depression, and worked for the War Department and helped get all the land for a little building called the Pentagon for World War II. And my four brothers and my sister Annie all have law degrees. So it's a family that's been steeped in the law. And my son Scott is a practicing attorney in Chardon, Ohio. So it makes for a lot of political discussion, so to speak, and not always unheated. But
Well,
that's
family
okay.
discussions can be tough that
Yeah,
way.
yeah. Well, look, it's a bunch of Irish political legal types, so you can imagine. But my dad definitely ruled the roost when it came to all that.
So would you be willing to take some questions from
Sure.
the audience?
I'd be
So-
delighted to.
Okay, so let's see. We do have a comment from Bridget. I've read the
Yes.
book and it reads way more like a movie. Keeping with the entertainment track, let's see what she says here. And to find her full chat. Oh, who would play each character in the movie version? Now, some of the people haven't read it, but for those of us who have, who plays you, who plays Fat Tony, those kind of people?
Yeah. Well,
Buddy Joe.
I think I get played by Brad Pitt. That's my selection. And my wife would be played by some modern version of an Audrey Hepburn type. So I'm trying to think who that might be these days. And Fat Tony, I think Jack Black would be perfect. He would be perfect.
He's a great actor.
Yeah, he would be superb. So
Gotcha.
there you go, Bridget. Who would play you? Never mind, I'll go into that later. Go ahead, Kath.
No, I'm just saying, you can either send us a chat or turn your mic
Turn the
off.
microphone on.
Yeah, yeah. What other questions? Don't be shy.
Yeah, if you like drama, and so those of you who are talking to other people, don't let them pigeonhole this book as some kind of a dry book about political machinations. It's not.
So it looks like Helena has a question. What was
Yes.
that, Helena?
Yeah, how has writing the book changed you?
I think it's giving me an awful lot of respect for those people that write and publish books. You know, the writing of the book just requires sequestering yourself in doing the work. And a lot of times you'll see a video or live conference of an author, and somebody stands up and says, I want to be a writer. What should I do? And 9 times out of 10, the person giving the lecture says, if you want to know how to be a writer, write. In other words, exercise the discipline, put pen to paper. So many people are afraid to write because they're concerned it's not going to be just right and so forth. Until you put something on paper or you're using your computer. And by the way, I use a computer program called Dragon, and that's very helpful where I can actually dictate my thoughts. But everybody has their own methodology. Until you put it on paper, you get it down, then you can't go back and edit it and make it better. And so the person that's hesitant to write because they're not sure it's not going to be right, it's not going to be where they want it to be, it's never going to be right the first time. And editing, that is making changes over time. This book probably went through 100 edits. And there are a lot of reasons for that, but you can always say something a different way. And so you should get feedback. So once you get something down, you do your own edit, then let somebody else look at it and make some what you think are constructive changes. But the process itself is really that of hunkering down and writing. Then once you get that done, and this is where I have so much respect for writers that get published, is getting published. Is very, very, very difficult because finding a publisher Someone else who wants to publish a book is difficult because you have to have an agent. You've probably heard of this in the entertainment field. So-and-so never got an audition for a part because they didn't have an agent. And that's right. And it's the same way in the book field. The major publishers do not interface directly with writers. They interface with agents. So you have to get an agent to read your book. And a terrible shame of this industry is that agents don't read books to decide whether they want to represent the book. They don't read the book. They accept something called a query letter, which is a one-page, maybe 250-word summary, and that's all the agents look at. And that's really, really depressing. So I must have sent out 100 query letters, and whereas somebody might read my book, go, man, that's great. How do you put that into 250 words that makes somebody else who's dealing with Simon & Schuster to agree to represent your book? The other problem is books tend to be like movies in the sense that certain genres become very popular. Right now, still very popular are books about zombies. Zombie books are popular. But imagine going to an agent saying, I got this book about this election I was in a relatively smaller town. I think it's pretty dramatic. Here's what happened. And if they can't find what is the popular flavor of the day in your book, you may have a diminished chance of getting published.
Now, did you have any authors that were mentors to you?
Not really, although I certainly shared my manuscript with a lot of people. There was one author who was very helpful, and believe it or not, his name is Michael Jordan, and he's also a former lawyer, and he writes books about crime, famous crimes. He's got a book out, which escapes me at the moment, the name, but it's a book about the torso murder cases. Kathy, I know you're familiar with that. That happened in Cleveland in the early 1930s, I think.
We actually had him. We had him for a book discussion.
Yes. What was his book called, Kathy?
I can tell you in a second while you continue talking.
Yeah, and I read his book and I met with him. Also, I met with, well, as you're looking up things for me, Kathy, a guy who was pretty helpful to me, who wrote a book called Badge 357.
Oh, Bob Sperna.
Right.
Yeah.
And that's a book about a police officer in Cleveland who was nationally famous. In fact, he was called Super Cop, probably the great, for my money, the greatest police officer ever served anywhere in America, highly decorated, and he's a friend of mine. So Bob Sperna was very helpful as well. And Bob does some publishing with a publishing firm called I think it's Kent State University Press.
Yeah, Kent State University Press.
Yeah. So I did, Helena, have some guidance from that standpoint. But interestingly enough, writers don't tell other writers how to write because everybody has their own style, their own way of expressing themselves. And so the assumption is, what you're doing when it comes to the writing. Writers give advice about how to navigate this morass of difficulty of getting published. It's just a tough thing to do. It's a terrible shame that Stephen King could scribble something on toilet paper and somebody would publish it and spend $1 million promoting it and it would sell a lot. And Stephen King is still doing some pretty good writing, and again, I'm not trying to insult anybody, but John Grisham has probably published about 30 books in his life. The first 10 were really good. The last 20 were really terrible, but because it's Grisham, it's everywhere.
The book you were looking for was The Company of Demons by Michael Jordan.
Yep.
And we had him for a book discussion a couple of years ago based on your recommendation. So you have to tell us about the other David Lynch in your life.
Yes. Well, he's not so much in my life, but he's certainly in the lives of millions of people. David Lynch is he hasn't produced a film or directed a film for a long time, but he's an Academy Award winning film director who won an Academy Award for a really beautiful movie, although dark and disturbing, called The Elephant Man. And he also got great notoriety fairly recently. He started a TV series called Twin Peaks, which was very well accepted on ABC about 15 or 20 years ago. And then he did a reboot of that. I think it was on Netflix or Amazon Prime or HBO, one of those. And so the reboot finished up maybe a couple of years ago or so. And he is sort of known as being offbeat, odd. That's what made Twin Peaks so popular. It was just he would be gratified to hear that someone describes his work as weird. Elephant Man was the most traditional movie or media product that he's ever done. Everything else has been kind of strange. He did a production called Eraserhead, which I've never seen before. And he's about 65, 66 years old, but he spends most of his time promoting something called the David Lynch Foundation, which is out of New York City. And they've raised almost $1 billion in order to help people learn transcendental meditation in settings where it might make a difference, like in prisons and women's shelters and in urban schools. He's got people out there teaching them how to do TM. And his board consists of great luminaries: Paul McCartney, Jerry Seinfeld, Hugh Jackman. These are, you can imagine how he's been able to raise $1 billion. And the money is used to train people to go out in the world and teach TM to those that would maybe have so much chaos and difficulty in their life that they might benefit from it. And that's the other David Lynch.
And how did it affect your publishing of your book, though?
Oh, well, there were some delays there as well, because I had to contact his legal representatives to make sure publication of my book didn't end up causing some friction with the David Lynch group, because I'm about David Lynch's age. It's a story and it's described as very dramatic. He is involved in drama. Interestingly enough, he's never published any prose, except for he's got a little book that's about inspiration called The Big Fish. But it's a small book, but he's never done anything like this. And so I was in touch with his general counsel in order to make sure that the publication of my book did not result in some kind of a lawsuit. I mean, the law says I'm entitled to use my name. I was born with it. But nonetheless, the best way to stave off litigation is to make sure any potential plaintiffs don't have a problem with what you're doing. So that was a pretty
that was what I wanted you to explain, because I knew about that. So
yeah. Now that it's released, who knows? I don't know if we'll hear from them again, but I'll tell you this much: the book is dramatic enough that if I were David Lynch, the director, I'd come out of directing retirement and want to turn this into some kind of a screenplay and a movie, because it does. One of the comments that Bridget made a few moments ago is that it reads like a movie. It is very cinematic. The chapters are short, and you can almost imagine each chapter as being a scene. And then the next chapter goes to another scene, another conversation in another setting. So it's very cinematic from that standpoint. And I think that really, it adds to the drama, and it adds to your being able to use your imagination to sort of get a feeling for what's happening. So the theater of the mind, so to speak, certainly has some good direction from the way the chapters are laid out.
have you ever thought of applying the same methodology to maybe a famous case you handled, or an exciting or dramatic case that you handled when you were practicing law?
That's not a bad idea. And if I do get into another nonfiction, I will talk about that, because I've had some actually very dramatic courtroom litigation things. And but the fact that I like to be descriptive, my major in undergraduate school was English literature. So as you can probably tell, I like to talk and present and describe concepts. That works very well when standing in front of a jury. And so I had some in my career, three or four especially very dramatic cases with very dramatic outcomes. But we'll see if we can get the Snowball's chance properly birthed first.
That's right. Put the cart before the horse, right?
Yeah, yeah.
So anyone else, any questions? Helena, audience members?
If anybody wants to unmute themselves in the
Please
gallery.
don't be shy.
I guess my question would be, what would you consider to be the main theme of the book, and what would you want the reader to learn or get from reading your book?
I
think you went over this a little bit.
Yeah, a little bit. I think there are two main themes. The first theme is don't shy away from a challenge if you can marshal the courage and the stick-to-itiveness. Don't let people talk you out of chasing after your dream. It's the successful careers of the world are littered or described with pathways of people trying to stop them from pursuing their dream. I read a biography of Phyllis Diller, believe it or not, a few years ago. And one of the things she talked about, and by the way, this TV series on Amazon Prime, this Mrs. Maisel, is a little bit taken off the life of Phyllis Diller, also Joan Rivers. But both of those ladies got rid of people in their lives that said, you can't do it. You can't. In other words, if somebody tells you you're too old, you may not be too old unless you try to do it, or you're too young, or you're too inexperienced. And of course, when I was running for mayor, that was the theme. You're too young, you're too inexperienced, it's impossible, the odds are against you. But if you apply yourself, Michael Jordan was cut, I think, from his high school basketball team. And so he just went out in his backyard and shot baskets. Jack Nicklaus became a successful golfer because he was at practice range literally until his hands were bleeding. So the point is determination, hard work, belief in yourself. You can do it. And even if you end up not being successful, it's really the journey that's fulfilling, and you learn from the journey. Hurdles and failures are what you learn from to become better. But the second theme is sort of this thing I was talking, it's almost a civil rights theme about what America was like in inner ring suburbs throughout America in the middle 1980s. And you had a series of communities like Euclid all over the place, Euclid, Parma, the major cities, Detroit, Philadelphia, New York, all around the country. You had these sort of inner ring suburbs that were white enclaves that wanted to make sure that Black people never moved into the community. And America kind of grew up, not just because of what happened with myself in Euclid, but that transition and a better understanding of really applying the fairness of the 14th Amendment to real life in municipal government, that came upon cities all across the country. So I would say that's the other story behind the book. So David beats Goliath, and while David's beating Goliath, he brings some racial justice to a place that's otherwise sadly lacking in that. Those are the two themes to some extent. Carl Stokes was the first mayor of a major American city in the 1960s. His son, Carl Jr., gave one of the book endorsements that's on the back of the dust cover of this book. So it just goes to show you that there's it's not just the drama of the small guy defeating the giant. It's the opportunity to do something good along the way.
I think that tells everybody this book is worth reading. And if you would like to buy it, Dave is going to drop off some at the law library here in the county courthouse on the 4th floor next week sometime. And
Yep.
so we'll be able to sell those. Someone has a comment. This reminds me of what Dennis Kucinich describes in his book about the political machine. My second point is that this still exists today.
Yeah, I think so. You know, the entering suburbs, Wanda, experienced this transition, so to speak, in the 80s and 90s, but you still have these enclaves all over the country. And some of these practices may be practiced less blatantly, but nonetheless practiced under the surface with a wink and a nod elsewhere in the country. And I think that's really very much quite true. And it's, you know, you can change laws, but it's difficult to change hearts. And I think we've made tremendous strides in this country, but you know, the underlying demon of one of the quote from Carl Stokes Jr. on my back sort of says a little bit, and Carl Jr. writes, David Lynch reminds us that evil, injustice, and terror find themselves in each other's company all too often. This book is a wild ride from page one. That, you know, this combination of people with evil hearts who get their hands on the levers of the machinery of government, it's a bad and dangerous combination. And of course, we can see in other countries today where that's happening in very extreme ways, like North Korea. So
Wanda says, well said. I think that makes a nice segue to concluding this program. But before we leave,
yes.
I had asked Dave ahead of time when we were going to hold this event in person, knowing that he was a singer, whether he would like to provide a song for us. And I reminded Dave this morning, and he said he would be willing. And now that I know that he tried out for Phantom.
Well, it's funny that you say that because I'm a little bit hoarse right now, but
Well, that's okay.
No, I'm going to dial up so you'll all be able to hear it. I have the audio of my audition for Phantom. Now, this will seem a little bit, it's actually an Italian opera piece from an opera called Tosca, but this will give you some idea of what it is that I'm hoping that the folks at the Phantom will say yes to. They don't want a piece from Phantom. They actually picked this piece for me to sing, and here's how it goes. It's only about 60 seconds, folks, so don't be put off. This aria is about a man who's about to get executed. And he's singing about his true love and reminiscing what it's like to be holding her in his arms. And now he's about to die. So it's very sad and dramatic. There you go. You asked for it, you got it.
Bravo.
Someone says absolutely beautiful. I agree. And you sound so different when you sing.
Yeah, do you remember a fellow that played a sitcom role by the name of Jim Neighbors?
Yeah.
Okay.
Oh, his,
Jim
yes.
Neighbors, when he was Gomer
Yes.
Pyle, oh, how do you talk like this? This is Jim Neighbors. And
Yes.
then he asked me to sing something, and this gigantic baritone would come barreling
Yes.
out. It
A
didn't make any
beautiful,
sense.
beautiful voice. Yes, I agree.
Yeah,
That's
so
a good
that's
analogy.
not
But
untypical.
you don't sound like Jim Neighbors, though.
Well, that's okay. Well, I'm a tenor. He's a baritone.
Yeah. So, well, thank you to everyone today. That was a wonderful program, Dave. We will be posting this recording on our YouTube channel probably by next week. And I want to thank you to everyone who attended and so much to our speaker. Good luck with the sales of your book.
Delighted. It's available right now at Kindle, and then it'll be available in hardcover right around March 15th on Amazon. So thanks, Kathy, to the whole Library Association. It's the greatest law library in America.
Oh, thank you.
And also I would be partnered with the greatest library association in America, the Cleveland Library Association. Helena, anybody says, well, what's a library really like? And they go to some suburban library. I said, look, you haven't been to a library until you go to the Lou Stokes building downtown. That's a library.